Our role in Iraq will be as a dealing with it's just to be available, to continue to train, to assist, to help, and to deal with ISIS as it arrives. But we are not going to be by the end of the year in a combat mission.
With the US seeking to reduce its military presence in Iraq by the end of 2021, the White House says it will maintain its commitment to the strategic relationship with Baghdad. Hello and welcome to Inside America with me, Ghida Fakhry. The US administration is expected to formalize the end of Washington's combat mission in Iraq by the end of the year, shifting to what US officials say will be the training and advising of Iraqi forces. There are currently an estimated 2,500 US troops still in Iraq. Iraq's Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi says his country no longer needs American troops.
The Iraqi army and security forces today are ready and capable of defending themselves. We only need the support and the development of our capabilities. We do not need any foreign combat forces on Iraqi soil. The circumstances in Iraq today are different than in 2014. Yes, there are sleeper cells, which we deal with on a daily basis with our brave forces, but Iraq is definitely not like Afghanistan.
Following the US's troop withdrawal from Afghanistan at the end of August and the ensuing total collapse of the Afghan government, some Iraqis are wary about the US troop pullout and what it could mean for their country. In a few moments, I'll be speaking with Anthony Zinni, the former head of the US Central Command, about the Biden administration's decision to withdraw combat troops from Iraq 18 and a half years after the US-led invasion and the toppling of Saddam Hussein. But first, we look back at the legacy of the US occupation and the decisions made by the Coalition Provisional Authority, the CPA, established in the aftermath of the invasion in March of 2003 to rule Iraq. I spoke with Paul Bremmer, who headed the CPA. Ambassador Bremer, when you look back at the start of the war in Iraq, was this invasion, which was neither in self-defense against an armed attack nor sanctioned by a UN Security Council resolution authorizing the use of force, but a war that was built on lies and deception about weapons of mass destruction, and which the International Commission of Jurists in Geneva said was a war of aggression? Was this war the original sin?
No, it was not. I think the President of the United States, whether he had been George Bush or Al Gore, faced with the intelligence. Now, it turns out the intelligence was wrong. But it wasn't just the American intelligence services, it was the British, the French, the Germans, the Russians, and the Israelis. All of their intelligence services shared the conclusion that Saddam had a program of nuclear weapons. And in fact, when I was in Iraq, we found evidence in interviews with former Iraqi scientists involved in the nuclear program that Saddam had continued and had plans to continue his programs, his personnel, and his funding for weapons of mass destruction had he survived.
But if there were weapons of mass destruction, Ambassador, why weren't they found? Why wasn't the evidence presented? To this day, there hasn't been any evidence presented to the world that there were weapons of mass destruction. Let's face it.
What I said was that the intelligence concluded there were weapons of mass destruction, and the intelligence, as it turns out, was wrong.
And the intelligence, many people will point out and have pointed out through the years, was politically driven. Now, you have repeatedly said in the last few years that Iraq is in a much better place today than it was under Saddam Hussein. But Al-Qaeda wasn't in Iraq before the US invasion. ISIS wasn't even born yet. Isn't it the plain reality that the invasion of Iraq, the occupation that you oversaw, the actions you took as head of the Coalition Provisional Authority, the CPA, especially that order to disband the entire Iraqi army, was what led to the civil unrest, the ethnic strife, and the birth of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and then ISIS?
What we found out, and we didn't find out that until 2004, was that Zarqawi intended to kill as many Shia as possible in Iraq to provoke an ethnic war between the Shia, and the Sunnis. The ISIS did not appear until just after President Obama made the decision to withdraw all American forces from Iraq at the end of 2011. That's when ISIS came into effect. And ISIS was, if you want to call it that, Al-Qaeda version 3 in Iraq. Ansar al-Islam, Al-Qaeda itself, and then ISIS.
But do you still believe then, based on what we know today, that Iraq is much better off than before the invasion?
Yes, I do.
Are you sure, though? Did you check with the millions of Iraqis who lost their loved ones, with people whose country was largely destroyed by war, basic infrastructure, as we know, in ruins, social fabric ripped apart? Many consider this view from the person who some, including the UN envoy at the time, called the dictator of Iraq, as sheer arrogance or even total blindness. What do you say to that?
Well, first of all, the first question that the first point that I disagree with you on is I think the Iraqi people are immeasurably better off today, pretty much by any economic measure you want to take. They have a problem which is endemic in the whole region, which is corruption. And that is structural problem because the government owns the only source of income, which is oil. And every country that is dependent on a single source of income where the government owns it is going to have corruption problems. They are very severe. There's no question. And the Iraqis now have a different problem, which is not the traditional terrorist problem. It is the infiltration into Iraq of about 100,000 special people's mobilization units, as they're called, who are Iranian sponsored. And they're not necessarily terrorists, but they are certainly outside the control of the central government. We didn't make that happen. That is a problem that has been inflicted on the Iraqis by the Iranians.
But hold on, Ambassador, it's easy to blame everyone else, but don't you sometimes take a step back and wonder to what extent some of your policies, including disbanding the entire army, putting out a pool of some 400,000 disgruntled, armed young men out of a job, making them easy recruits for groups like ISIS. Don't you ever wonder how much that has fueled the insurgency and whether this policy should have been implemented? Because President Bush said the policy was to keep the army intact, but that didn't happen.
Yes, that's right. And that was no fault of President Bush. That was the facts on the ground, which were reported to him. I was still a businessman at the time, at the fall of Baghdad on April 9th, when the general in charge reported there was not a single unit of the Iraqi army standing to arms anywhere in the country. The army self-demobilized, as the Pentagon put it. I have no regrets about the decision. By the way, you're wrong.
Can you honestly say that 400,000 men simply, a whole army simply evaporated? I mean, whose orders were you following, if not the president's? Was it Cheney's? Was it Rumsfeld's?
The army went home on its own. The army was composed of about 315,000 drafted almost entirely Shia infantrymen. They were directed by 415,000 officers, almost entirely Sunni, some Kurdish Sunnis, but almost entirely Arab Sunnis. That army went home on its own. What our order said was only the top generals, there were about 8,000 of them, could not serve in the government and could not find a place in the new Iraqi army, which we started training 3 weeks after I got there. We said explicitly when we built the new army that anybody from the old army up to the rank of colonel was welcome to apply for a position in the new army. When I left Iraq a year later, 80% of the enlisted men and of the officers and NCOs in the new army were in fact from the old army. The people from the old army were welcome to go out and work in business if they wanted to. They could set up television stations, some did. They could set up newspapers, they could set up businesses. If they joined the insurgency, it was not because they didn't have a chance, it was because they didn't agree with the idea of a democratic Iraq.
But why then? Why maybe they didn't agree with an occupied Iraq to begin with, but why then disband the army again, Ambassador Bremer? Because Anthony Zinni, former chief of CENTCOM, said the plan was that the army would be the foundation of rebuilding the Iraqi army. Many of the Sunnis who were chased out ended up on the other side with Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And it has been estimated, as you know, that the majority of ISIS' top 40 leaders once served in the Iraqi army. So clearly, there was more incentive and more room for them in the insurgency than there was in the new Iraqi army.
No, they made a choice of their own. They made a choice of their own. If they didn't come and take advantage of the opportunities that were available to them in Iraq, it was because they didn't agree with the vision of a democratic Iraq.
Well, you speak about the vision of a democratic Iraq, and you spoke earlier about the corruption that you essentially suggest was fueled by Iraqis themselves. But there were several other CPA orders besides disbanding the army that fueled Iraqis' resentment. There was the order to grant all foreign contractors operating inside Iraq immunity from the Iraqi legal process, essentially immunity from any kind of civil or criminal lawsuits for their actions. There was the order to change Iraq's centrally planned economy and allow unlimited, unrestricted foreign investment, giving the US and multinationals the right to dominate Iraq's economy. Was it for the occupying power to rewrite these laws, to rewrite the laws of the country it was occupying the way you did?
I had only one objective, which was given to me by President Bush, and it was clear: help the Iraqis recover direction of their own country, both politically and economically. And I believe the record is quite clear and will show that within the limits of what was possible, given the short time we had and the very shortage of people we had the whole time, we did about as well as anybody could.
But there was the Abu Ghraib prisoner abuse, Ambassador, as well under your watch. You were the chief administrator of Iraq. Some had informed you, including the first human rights minister on the Iraqi side, someone called Abdul Basit Turki, said he informed you early on about the rampant abuse at Abu Ghraib and that nothing happened, that his request to visit the military prison was even denied by you. Again, when you look back, what do you think of this episode that left such a blemish on the United States record in Iraq?
Well, I agree with you. It was a shock and an outrage when we heard about it. And in the end, the military, which was in charge of that prison, had to, well, the people in charge were punished as they should have been.
Just finally, Ambassador, if I can, just looking forward to the potential withdrawal from Iraq, now that we know that President Biden intends to withdraw combat troops from Iraq by the end of the year. I know you've said in the past that you're always uneasy about these troop withdrawals. We know there are 2,500 US troops right now in Iraq, probably many hundreds, if not thousands more, private contractors. Is there anything that justifies the US maintaining its military presence so long in Iraq? I think it's about 15 years after President Bush declared mission accomplished. Is it time for the US to leave?
Well, I think the results of when we pulled out of Afghanistan answer the question. We need to keep troops on the ground. In the case of Iraq, they're not in a combat role. They are providing intelligence support, counterterrorism training, and intelligence to the Iraqi army. And I think they should stay there. I would hope that the current administration would have learned from the disaster when they pulled out of Afghanistan, that they don't want to have a second one on their hands, which would be the risk of pulling out of Iraq.
All right, Ambassador Paul Bremmer, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Nice to be with you.
In anticipation of the American troop withdrawal later this year, France has vowed to maintain its military presence in Iraq to, quote, fight terrorism. This followed a deadly suicide attack by ISIS last month, which killed 35 people and injured over 50 in a Baghdad market. So then, could the US announcement that it will be repurposing its military presence bring about a new dynamic in Iraq? I'm joined by retired four-star United States Marine Corps General Anthony Zinni, former Commander-in-Chief of the United States Central Command, CENTCOM. General Zinni, you just heard Paul Bremer say he thinks the US should keep troops in Iraq, that he hopes the Biden administration essentially learned from what he called the disaster of pulling out of Afghanistan. Do you agree with him?
Well, I don't think we should continue to do the same thing. I mean, as Einstein said, it's the ultimate definition of insanity. What's the purpose? Obviously, the nation building was not going well. The threat we came to deal with was in Pakistan, and we created a whole new set of threats in the Levant and with Syria and the invasion of Iraq. Uh, to say we should continue, you would have to tell me what's the strategy. If it's more of the same, I do not agree.
You say we shouldn't continue doing the same thing, but you supported the US troop surge in Iraq in 2007. You supported it in Afghanistan in 2009. So, with or without a troop surge, the US had to exit. In Afghanistan, in humiliation, many here in the United States feel. With the benefit of hindsight, do you accept today that these were wrong-headed decisions that prolonged the war, that cost more casualties? Do you regret these decisions?
Well, first of all, I did not support going into Iraq. I was very clear on that. I said in my testimony to Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and I was very vocal that we needed to go after Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda was not in Iraq. I did not understand the purpose of going into Iraq. Saddam was contained. As far as Afghanistan was concerned, I felt I had concern that we were going in with too few troops. It was over reliance on the Northern Alliance to deal with Al Qaeda. That did not work out. When Al Qaeda fled to Pakistan, our purpose had moved, and we stayed in Afghanistan and Iraq to do nation building and created a bigger problem than we had in the beginning, and never went after the real target, which was Al Qaeda.
So, should US officials be held accountable for what happened in Iraq, for waging a war that has largely destroyed the country, for fueling the rise of ISIS? And as you know, many administration officials in the Bush administration not only claimed, obviously, Bush and Cheney claimed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction that posed a threat, an imminent threat to the United States. Nothing was found, of course. But there were also those, including Bremer and others, who tried to make a direct link between Saddam Hussein and Al Qaeda, although you know as well as I know that they were sworn enemies. Should these officials be held accountable for having plunged the United States into that war?
Well, absolutely, they should be held accountable. There was no weapons of mass destruction. We ended up with the inspectors back in, with Inspectors K and others. They did another round of inspections. They could not find any evidence. All the intelligence that we were receiving from Ahmed Shalabi and his merry band of Gucci guerrillas that were discredited by the Germans and others, it was clear. If you remember, Rumsfeld said, well, now we have our troops in the desert and it's summertime and we have to use them. That's a hell of a reason for going to war. So, we had no casus belli for Iraq.
So who is going to be held accountable? The politicians, obviously, the top leaders, the former president, haven't been held accountable. If not the politicians, then who?
The buck stops with the president, and I think he has to look toward those that advised him to go into Iraq, and the rationale for it, and the intelligence and the intelligence failures, which again have caused us to have an exodus from Afghanistan in a way that was obviously embarrassing to us.
Are you saying this was Rumsfeld, Cheney, and others?
I think that those that encourage the president to take this action, if it's Cheney, if it's Rumsfeld, if it's Wolfowitz, they bear the responsibility for this. And the president was given bad advice and bad options and bad intelligence.
What about the generals who also implemented these orders to go to war and to prolong this war? If it's not the politicians being held accountable, then it has to be the generals. It's one or the other, maybe both.
Well, remember, first of all, I'm not defending generals, but generals do what they're told. I mean, obviously, there is a decision to enter Iraq, and it's given to the generals to execute. I would have liked to have seen the generals, my successors, push back more on the plan. The plan I left in 2000, if we had to go into Iraq, required 380,000 troops. You had to seal the borders, get control of the population, make sure any resistance was reduced, protect the people, ensure stability. We knew inside that there would be ethnic rivalries and religious rivalries that would pop their head up. You had to replace the government as quickly as possible in terms of governance, economic systems that had to be run. They tried to do it on a cheap. This was the advice that was coming out of the Department of Defense and elsewhere. And the generals needed to stand up and be heard. This was a plan that was developed over 10 years and was thrown away by Rumsfeld and company. And the generals, much like what they did in Vietnam, were nowhere to be seen or heard.
Was there simply no strategy, as you said earlier? Was there also an active intent to mislead the American public, to mislead Congress into believing that the war was going far better than it actually was?
Well, I think some ways it's self-deceiving. I think you can begin to believe what you want to believe out there. It obviously comes to light now that this wasn't, let's say in Afghanistan, a 300,000 viable military. Now we're learning about ghost soldiers, military pay being taken by the senior generals out there, corrupt government, obviously not responsive to the people's needs. And the trouble is we were building a myth. And the victims in this are not only our troops and the sacrifice they made and the treasure that we lost, but those young Afghans, particularly the women that we gave hope to. And we created something that wasn't real. And that came crashing down all of a sudden because the foundation was never there.
Was part of the myth as well to do with what US politicians have said for years, that the US occupation is not what created and fueled ISIS? Do you agree essentially with Bremer, who just told me ISIS didn't appear until after President Obama made the decision to withdraw troops from Iraq at the end of 2011? Most experts and historians agree. And Obama himself even admitted it, that ISIS emerged out of al-Qaeda in Iraq as a response to the US invasion. When exactly it emerged doesn't really matter under what label, does it?
Well, you have to realize that lack of going in with sufficient forces, not getting control of the situation, the borders and everything else, you provided the breeding ground for an ISIS in Iraq to develop. And I think this is a little bit of revisionist history about how it all happened. When we first went into Iraq, we had no plans for the reconstruction. Prior to Bremmer, there was this little ORHA organization that was supposed to be the governance facilitator. It never was effective. There were things that we thought, at least on the military side, we should not do, like disband the military, vet their leadership. If they didn't fight, make sure they're getting paid. Don't put people out in the street with their AK-47s and no work to be had. That's a recipe for creating the kinds of problems that resulted.
Whose decision was it to disband the military? Was it Bremmer's, Bush's, Cheney's?
Well, I'm sure everybody in that lineup that you gave were involved in that decision, but it didn't make sense at the time. You eliminate the Republican Guard and those that were most loyal, but the regular army and those that were as much victims of Saddam as anybody else, you do things like vet the leadership, and you also make sure that they're controlled in some way. We didn't have the power to control. We didn't control the armories. We didn't control the weapons supply dumps. Too few troops, no plan, and that's what you get.
General Anthony Zinni, former commander of CENTCOM, thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you.
I saw firsthand Defense Secretary Rumsfeld and Bremer tour U.S. Army facilities in and around Baghdad with bravado as American conquistadors back in the summer of 2003. And I, like many other fellow journalists, saw already then how the disinformation campaign played out, the active policy of pushing a narrative that was divorced from reality, sheer naked propaganda, or maybe delusion. Throughout 2 decades of America's post-9/11 wars, U.S. generals have provided the American public and Congress with an upbeat assessment of the wars. Truthfulness would have demoralized their troops and weakened the political agenda of the administration. So they painted a misleading, rosier picture of the reality of wars they probably knew deep down they couldn't win. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq weren't going according to plan, and they lied, at least by omission, with no consequences. Since 2001, there have been more than 1.3 million disciplinary cases in the U.S. Armed Forces. Like Vietnam, Afghanistan and Iraq broke the ethos of the service members. Every day, 18 veterans of these 2 last wars of occupation commit suicide. But not one US general has faced disciplinary action, not even for Abu Ghraib, which brought infamy on the US military. Instead, generals were decorated. As an officer once remarked, a private who loses a rifle suffers far greater consequences than a general who loses a war that Joe Biden championed as the all-influential chairman of the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee in 2002, when Congress granted President Bush the authority to invade Iraq. Biden strongly argued in favor of the war, saying, quote, "I do not believe this is a rush to war. I believe it is a march to peace and security." And so, in short, President Biden may want to pull troops out of Iraq, but there is little doubt that the 2002 war authorization he actively backed has come back to haunt him. In the end, his former boss, President Obama, was forced to admit, quote, "ISIS is a direct outgrowth of al-Qaeda in Iraq that grew out of our invasion," unquote, and not the other way around. And let us not forget, not 1 ounce of weapons of mass destruction was ever found in Iraq. That's all for this week from me, Ghida, Fakhry, and the team here in Washington. Thanks for watching.